Vincent van Gogh's famous irises have a new home. The painting sold 3 years ago for nearly $54 million. Today, the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles announced it has now bought the irises at a price not disclosed.
The topic today is the Getty Trust purchase of the Vincent van Gogh painting that you see right there, the irises. And Jay and Rob from the firm will contribute to this discussion. And we're also joined by Linda Pinkerton, the Trust General Counsel and a DMS alumnus. Jay, would you like to lead it off?
This past May, the irises lost the distinction of being the most expensive painting ever to be sold at auction when two paintings were sold for near $80 million. That wasn't the case, however, in March when Linda called me early one morning at home and asked if the firm would have any interest in assisting the Getty Trust to acquire the irises from Alan Bond. As you may imagine, I didn't take a long time thinking about the response on that, and we embarked on a 2-week whirlwind project that resulted in the acquisition of the painting. And what we'd like to do this morning is share with you a little bit of the process that we went through in order to acquire the painting. Linda will talk first a little bit about the background of the painting itself and the art market, and leading up to the interest of the trust in the painting. Rob will then discuss some of the background that he discovered as part of the due diligence into questions of title and other matters. And then I will wrap it up with a discussion of some of the solutions that we found to some of the problems. Linda?
It's awfully nice to see a lot of old friends again. Thanks very much for inviting me up to talk to you about this. I assume that most of you know Vincent van Gogh, a very famous Dutch painter of the 19th century, who painted the irises that we're talking about today. He was confined to a mental asylum in the south of France during the last years of his life, which ended in a very tragic suicide when he was in his 30s in 1890. But during those last years of his life, he painted his most brilliant paintings. He changed his style from very dark, very somber pictures, which he had painted in his native Holland, to bright, colorful pictures like the irises. And among his familiar subjects during those years were the flowers in the garden of the asylum where he was confined, including these irises in the painting which we purchased. This painting, the irises itself, is a particularly fine example of his work, and it was one of his 2 favorite paintings. It was exhibited in the Salon of the Independents in Paris, and it is in remarkably fine condition. The blue and green pigments in the painting, unlike many of his other pictures, remain unfaded. It's in an unblistered condition. It's just almost pristine, which was one of the things that made it especially attractive to us. Van Gogh used very cheap paint, and a lot of his pictures are unfortunately faded, particularly in reds and yellows, but not this one. Just before he died, he gave it to a French collector, and it remained in French hands until 1947, when Joan Whitney Payson purchased it for her own art collection for $40,000. It descended through her family to the point in 1987 when her son decided to sell the picture. Now, we have to have a little background here about the condition of the art market in the 1980s in order to understand why the painting was sold and the circumstances in which it was sold. About that time, the Japanese had entered the art market and were buying vigorously, particularly in the area of Impressionist paintings. And they were paying astronomically high prices for pictures. You may all remember that one of Van Gogh's famous paintings of sunflowers was sold for $39.6 million during that time to a Japanese insurance firm, which was an astounding number, an unheard of number to the art world. At the same time, Congress in 1986 changed the tax law and eliminated the incentive for wealthy art collectors to donate appreciated property such as this to art museums in the United States and take a tax deduction for the fair market value of the piece. So unfortunately for trustee owners who had other obligations and other uses of assets, as was the case here, and for other people who had inherited very valuable pictures and other works of art, it just became impossible for them to give these works of art to museums, and it became much more attractive for them to sell them. So against that background, John Whitney Payson decided to sell the picture on November 11th, 1987 at auction at Sotheby's in New York. And the other very important piece of the background here was, you may remember that in October 1987, the stock market crashed. And the painting had already been committed to the auction by that time. Sotheby's and Christie's were frantic about what might happen to the art market, and at that time everyone was in fact I will say, almost confident that the art market would crash also. But the test piece was this painting, and the test auction was this auction. So with your indulgence, I'm going to show you the videotape of the auction at which Alan Bond bought the painting. It's just the clip from his actual purchase of the picture.
All right, lot number 25 now. The Irises by Van Gogh. And what should we say to start it? Who'll say $15 million to start it? Is there a bid of $15 million to start it? I have a bid of $15 million for it. I have $15 million for it, 15. I have $15 million for it. The bid is up front at $15 million. I have $15 million for it, 15. $15,500,000. That's $15,500,000. I have $15,500,000 now. $16 million now. It's $16 million. I have $16 million for it, 16. $17 million now. I have $17 million for it, 17. The bid is over here now at $17 million for it. I have $17 million for it, $18 million on my left now at 18. I have $18 million now at 18 million, 19 here at $19 million now at 19. I have $20 million I have 20 on my left now at $20 million now for it. I have 20. At $20 million, $21 million now on the phone in front. I have 21 at $21 million for it now at 21 at $21 million for it, $22 million now at 22. The bid is here, $23 million I have 23 on the far side now at $23 million for it, at $23 million for it, $24 million now in the center at 24, 25. At $25 million now, at 25, I have 25 is your bid, at $25 million now for it, $26 million I have, $27 million now, at 27, at $27 million for it now, at 27, at $27 million for it, $28 million by two of you now, $29 million. At $29 million now on the far phone at 29. I have $29 million for it now on the far $30 million here at 30. I have $30 million now for $31 million I have 31 now. At 31 on the far phone at 31, $32 million is here. At $33 million now for it. At $33 million for it. I have $33 million now, $34 million I have 34, $35 million, at $35 million now for it, at 35, $36 million I have, $37 million, at 37 now, $38 million, $39 million, $40 million, $41 million, $42 million, $43 million, $44 million, $45 million, $46 million, $47 million now, $48 million for it, $49 million, I have $49 million against you in the center. Will you say 50? At $49 million then on the far phone, at $49 million then, all done, at $49 million. You still there, Geraldine? At $49 million then the bid is on the far phone, fair warning. Sold for $49 million. Thank you.
And tack onto that $49 million a little 10% buyer's premium that the buyer has to pay at auction at Sotheby's or Christie's. So it went for a little more than $49 million in the end. But nobody knew who bought the picture, and Sotheby's wouldn't tell. In fact, about a year went by, and Sotheby's absolutely kept mum about who had purchased the picture, and there was a lot of speculation. In fact, there was an assumption that it had been a Japanese insurance company again that just didn't want to incur the wrath of the Americans who could no longer enjoy this picture. But finally, Australian billionaire Alan Bond surfaced and announced that he'd been the buyer. Later, Rob will explain the circumstances under which Bond actually managed that acquisition. But suffice it to say that the art world was really shocked to learn that Sotheby's had loaned Bond half the money to buy the picture. And when I say the art world was shocked, the retail market, as opposed to the auction market, was infuriated because they believed that this kind of practice on the part of Sotheby's had artificially pumped up the prices. So there was a lot of confusion and a lot of anger for a while, but in the middle of all of that, Alan Bond's financial empire began to crumble, and more and more about this transaction began to tumble out into the press. And as Alan Bond's financial house of cards was collapsing, Sotheby's was facing increased pressure to do something about the fact that Alan Bond owed millions of dollars, and they were publicly traded stock and had to do something about their responsibility to their shareholders as well. So they began to try and market the picture in the fall of last year. There was a general concern in the public that the irises would be removed from public view, that it would go to Japan. Sotheby's didn't want to face that sort of criticism either. And so about that time, the Getty Trust entered the scene. Now, this was in the spring, the early spring of this year. The Getty Trust, which many of you may know about, was formed by J. Paul Getty, a very wealthy oil man, during his lifetime as the J. Paul Getty Museum. He left all of his personal wealth to the Getty Museum, which then acquired considerable additional wealth after the Texaco-Pennzoil deal and renamed itself the J. Paul Getty Trust. One of our activities is the museum, but we have many others also. As a private operating foundation, however, under the Internal Revenue Code, it's managed by a board of trustees, which takes very seriously its responsibility for all of its activities. And those activities include acquisitions of important works of art for the museum. Now, the Getty Museum wanted to upgrade its collection of European paintings because although the museum is well known for the quality of its collection, that had been probably the weakest link in the chain. George Goldner, the curator of paintings, smelled a little blood here at Sotheby's. He knew there was a great masterpiece and a distress sale in the works, and I think with exquisite timing, he struck a deal with the president of Sotheby's and said, for a certain price, the Getty will buy this picture. And of course, that was the ideal solution for everybody. Bond would be off the hook, he would have his picture sold. Sotheby's would not only have the painting sold, but it would be in a prestigious collection and remain in the United States, and the Getty would acquire a great masterpiece. So, the painting, which had been squirreled away by Sotheby's in a secret location during the time that Alan Bond's financial collapse was underway, was flown in the mid of night to the Getty Museum. And the very next day, the Board of Trustees had a meeting, the acquisition committee of the Board of Trustees had a meeting at which they decided to recommend the purchase to the full board. I called Jay Powell and said, help, and we were on our way when the full board made its decision on Friday, May 9th, to go ahead with the acquisition, provided that I could be satisfied about the quality of the title. So I'll turn it over to Rob now to tell you what fun we had after that.
Well, after the Getty board gave approval to the commercial terms of the transaction, Linda and I took off to New York City for what we thought was going to be a 2-day reconnaissance trip. flip through the documentation for the relationship between Bond and Sotheby's. After all, how difficult could the documents be for buying a single asset? Well, our two-day trip turned into a 2-week trip as we stayed there until the transaction closed, and what I thought would be a letter agreement for the sale turned out to be a 2-inch thick closing memorandum. Our first inkling that our expectations were off was as we arrived at the Sotheby's auction house, where the lawyers came out with box after box of chattel mortgages and security agreements, legal opinions, and certificates showing the often stormy relationship between Alan Bond and Sotheby's. We were then shown to a box of our own, a conference room that was about 8 feet by 8 feet, where Linda and I spent the next few days. And because of the timing concerns I'll mention in a minute, it was quite clear that we were not terribly welcome to leave during that time. That the staff always brought us our lunches and dinners to us. We mentioned that having only brought 2 days worth of clothes, we needed some basic household items to keep ourselves presentable. But the Sotheby's staff instantly went out to the A&P and brought the groceries right to us. And, at one point, Linda mentioned that she needed to at least get some new clothing, and without batting an eye, the Sotheby's lawyer said they'd get a buyer from Bergdorf Goodman's to take a cab to the auction house and to size her up and come back with a couple of outfits. So the fine line between being an honored guest and being a hostage was beginning to blur. So cloistered in that room, we began to learn about Alan Bond personally and his relationship to the painting. He's best known to Americans, perhaps, as the head of the syndicate in Australia that developed the yacht with the secret keel that took the America's Cup away from us in 1983, and then unsuccessfully defended it in Perth in 1987. He began as a buyer and seller of real estate in Perth and expanded to real estate development during a construction boom there, and then used that asset base to acquire a number of Australian brewing companies during a time when the beer industry in Australia was consolidating, and also in the fields of cable television, natural resources, and shipping, a genuine empire in the west of Australia. This all culminated in his victory, quote unquote, in a bidding war for the Highland Brewing Company here in the United States, which is the fourth largest brewer here. And that was in September of 1987. And at that point, it seemed that he could do no wrong as long as his asset value was high on paper and people were taking his debt and the interest rates were reasonable. Then came the October 1987 stock market crash. And at first, he doesn't seem to have noticed it, witness the fact that just a couple of weeks after the crash, he pays $54 million for a Van Gogh. But it soon became clear that many of these acquisitions were not producing enough cash to service the debt he had incurred. And in a couple of cases, the stock market value of some of these companies in which he had an interest was below the principal amount of the acquisition debt. So that in some cases, not only was it not throwing enough cash out to service the debt, but in some cases the debt wasn't even worth servicing at least at those depressed prices. His Australian brewing companies were briefly placed in a receivership by indenture trustees. He had to fend off unsolicited bids for some of these companies from Rupert Murdoch and Robert Holmes à Court. And his biggest problem may be Heilemann here in the United States, which has yet to increase market share against the three major American beer companies. In the rosier times when he was acquiring the irises, he used a number of shelf companies to make the acquisition. These little companies in Hong Kong or Western Australia capitalized with just a few dollars of initial capital and the stock issued to employees or solicitors of Alan Bond. These newly formed companies had bizarre names that we were forced to deal with and make reference to. The one we had the most connection with was a company called Kvadrat Limited. Kvadrat being the normal spelling, Kvadrat. We still have no idea what a Kvadrat is. Best guess the lawyers have some sort of small marsupial. The legal title to the irises was held by these companies as trustee for a trust of which Alan Bond personally was the sole beneficiary. They borrowed funds from Sotheby's and gave a security interest, a chattel mortgage, in the painting itself to Sotheby's. So that's the ownership of the painting, at least from a legal standpoint. The other question of interest to us was the location of the painting during this period. The painting stayed with Sotheby's in New York while the details of the financial arrangement were being worked out and while Alan Bond was constructing an elaborate security system in his office building in Perth, high atop the tallest building there. Sotheby's agent then escorted the painting to Australia, where he put it in his office for what we believe to be only a couple of months before he allowed it to go on a traveling exhibition at museums at several different Australian cities, one in each province, adding to our legal questions. And during that time, the terms of the loan were frequently renegotiated. Each time there was a title transfer from one of these companies to another, or a payment date for principal was coming up that had to be extended, there would be a number of amendments and legal opinions that we had to wade through. Finally, though, the parties could not come to terms with yet another renegotiation, and the painting was abruptly removed from public display at the museum in Perth. Bond consented to Sotheby's retaking possession of the painting there, and the painting was moved to Europe in Sotheby's control. Now, our searches in Hong Kong and Australia and Europe and the United States didn't reveal any competing claims in these shelf companies, but the big question for us was, how does a $2 company buy a $54 million painting? And that's how we had to get into the question. Well, it turns out that the down payment made by these companies was furnished by yet another bond company called Gogh, as well as Mr. Bond personally. Also, repayment of the Sotheby's loan was guaranteed by Mr. Bond personally. Gogh is a substantial company. It has extensive dealings with third parties. For example, it was the tenant in the building that Bond had in Perth. More importantly, though, it guaranteed the issuance of a lot of debt securities that had been issued by some of these other bond companies, which were now under attack, under receivership, or generally being attacked by those creditors. And Bond himself undoubtedly had financial arrangements involving other creditors. And this is where the plot thickened for us, because creditors of Gogh or Bond could assert interest in the painting itself, assert that the loan should be avoided under a fraudulent conveyance or similar theory under the applicable laws. If the Getty bought the painting, there was the danger that these creditors could attempt to avoid that sale if the sale were made for substantially less than what was considered a fair market value, in a way that left Gogh or Bond insolvent in some sense as a result of the transaction. That could leave us with just a breach of contract suit, having to stand in line in an insolvency proceeding, and leave us without a painting. And this was not just a theoretical problem, because creditors of Gogh had begun to assert interest in the painting itself. One of the complications arose from the unique nature of the asset in terms of making this evaluation of our risks in the fraudulent conveyance area, because the fraudulent conveyance law is concerned with sales substantially below a fair market value. And at the time we were negotiating this, Iris's was, as Jay mentioned, the most expensive painting in the world. And what could we consider to be the fair market value in a time when the art market was in such flux? It depended so much on the psychology, the likes and dislikes of the present and future investors. There were some who said that the market was about to take off, others who said it was about to have a crash. There were those who said the painting itself had been in some sense tainted by the fact that Sotheby's had lent the money to Bond, or that it had been repossessed and it was bad goods and therefore would sell for less. There were other people who said, no, it's the finest available Van Gogh that's not already sequestered in a museum. And so we had no real handle on the market values in this area. And the final complication for us was just the time involved. There was already a consensus among the parties that a deal should be made, if at all, very, very quickly. And that pressure intensified when halfway through the negotiations, we all woke up to a front-page colored photograph story in the Los Angeles Times announcing that the Getty was considering buying the Van Gogh and that it was presently located in Malibu, California. So if any unpaid creditors or competing bidders wanted to make trouble for us, they now had the opportunity to, and we had to move fairly quickly if we were going to achieve the sale. So the problem, simply stated, was to try to get clear title to one of the more famous and expensive pieces of personal property in the world from a man whose financial empire was under a great deal of attack. And in the next 4 or 5 days, we had to digest the arrangements between Bond and Sotheby's, his own financial condition, evaluate the potential claims of creditors, figure out what protections we needed from Bond, from Sotheby's, from creditors and government officials, and most importantly, try to get those other companies and parties to give us those protections without having to give up too much. And this school, just as in real life, turned to Jay Powell to get us out of the jam.
Well, when Rob and Linda took themselves off to New York for a holiday, I stayed in San Francisco and set about drafting a purchase and sale agreement. And as the report started to drift in from the front, I could see that we were dealing with a problem that really boiled down to title. And what do we do about it under these circumstances? We recruited Carlisle Lane as a consultant and spent some time talking about the various complications that were starting to surface. And tucking a first draft of the agreement under my arm, I took off for New York and joined Rob and Linda, where we began discussions with Sotheby's and with Bond's attorneys. we had managed to obtain their release from their cracker box and had moved over into the attorney's offices for bond. That had been a last-minute decision. We had anticipated earlier that we probably would end up in Sotheby's attorney's offices. They're represented by Wild Gogh and Manges, which, as you've seen, they needed a substantial amount of creditors' rights advice in the transaction. But we ended up instead over at the offices of bonds attorneys, and which is a much smaller firm, and felt that at the end of the day gave us some leverage. As it turned out, as we got into it, that we really found that the party we had to do the most negotiating with was Sotheby's rather than Bond. Our first instinct in solving our title problem was to say, well, with all of these boxes full of security documents, the ideal thing would be to buy at a foreclosure sale. That way we will take advantage of the security interest in the title that Sotheby's has managed and has carefully protected for itself over the past year. And we would extinguish any interest that may have arisen during that period of time subordinate to them. That turned out, unfortunately, to be impossible. That was just too easy a solution. There were really reasons from both Sotheby's and from Bond's point of view why that was not a feasible approach. First, there was not a technical default under the arrangements, the credit arrangements, and moreover, it appeared that a sale under a foreclosure arrangement would have triggered cross-default provisions in many of Bond's other finance arrangements. And beyond that, from Sotheby's point of view, they were not prepared to take the risk of a negotiated sale at foreclosure for fear of later being challenged on the adequacy of the price. So we were left with all of this lovely security documentation that turned out to be of no real assistance to us. We had to take our title directly from Bond. And in approaching that, there are a number of steps you go through. One, you first have to figure out who owns the property to start with. Not an easy job with personal property in general. Not an easy job in this case. The transfers as they were related to us had not been well documented at each step, and we had some gaps in the trail. In addition, you have to find out who has claims against the painting, or who might have acquired claims against the painting, and do what you can to see that there are in fact no claims at the time you buy it. This painting had been traveling through Australia, had been in other parts of the world during that period of time, so that required our getting opinions from local council in a number of jurisdictions as to what was required in those jurisdictions in order for claims to have affixed themselves to the painting, and satisfy ourselves that none of that had occurred. Beyond that, we got bills of sale from everybody in sight. We got warranties of every shape and description you can imagine on title matters. But in the event of that we were looking at here, where the seller's a bit wobbly, you'd like to find a warranty from someone with a deep pocket, and so we sought and obtained a warranty as well from Sotheby's. Now that left us really with one additional problem that almost brought the deal to a stop, and that had to do with the fraudulent conveyance problem that Rob described to you, where we have a unique good of this sort. It's very difficult when you're the purchaser from someone who may be arguably insolvent to satisfy yourself that you're paying something that a court will later agree, in retrospect, was a fair market value. There is really no absolute protection. You just have to wait and see what develops. And the risk, of, as Rob explained it, is that the painting goes back to the trustee in bankruptcy or to the creditors of the seller, and you end up with a claim against them. Well, the trust really did want the painting and not a claim. We thrashed around with this problem for a good deal of time. We asked Sotheby's for an indemnity that would cover such an eventuality. And it's really a question of who would ultimately bear the risk that the price that was paid was ultimately determined to be not fair value. We ultimately were able to reach agreement on the forms of a satisfactory indemnity there. We turned it into an occasion for wrapping up a handful of other issues that had become questions in the process, and we proceeded then and closed it. The transaction from beginning to end took just 2 weeks, which is kind of a refreshing change from some of the other deals and cases that we handle around here. So the story came to a happy end. The painting is now in the Getty Museum, where it continues to draw great crowds, and the reproduction we have of it here doesn't really do it justice. I think Linda would invite all of us down to have a look for ourselves. We have a few minutes, I think, if there are any questions for Linda or Rob.
Consideration has never been revealed.
That's right. That's right.
Accepting Linda's statement that this is one of Van Gogh's 2 favorite paintings, what's the other one?
Starry Night in the Museum of Modern Art, which they bought just a short while ago, actually.
I don't remember whether you or Linda can act this. How does, well, I guess Linda, how are you positive that the painting you have is the original Van Gogh iris? What's shipped around?
You're addressing the point of warranty of authenticity, too.
Yeah.
And that's a good question. One of the reasons that the painting was flown to the museum before the trustees would buy it is the reason that we bring almost every object that we buy to the museum. We have very sophisticated scientific equipment, and we look everything over pretty carefully before we buy it. We have one of the finest paintings conservators in the world on our staff, and we x-ray these paintings. We take a little sample of the paint, it's subjected to scientific analysis, and most important in a case like this, we know every place this painting has been from the time it left Van Gogh's easel, which is one of the things that enhances the value of an object. When there's a big missing piece in the provenance, then you have to wonder where it's been and so forth. But there's never been a question about the authenticity of this object. And Van Gogh wrote about it. I mean, he wrote about it in his letters to his brother and so forth.
Well, just in case I want to buy it.
This is not the real painting, contrary to many people believe.
I'm a little puzzled about how somebody would acquire a claim if the painting was lent to a museum somewhere else in Australia for 2 months and then moved on. Can you explain that as a legal matter? What kind of a claim is
The question is, how can someone acquire a claim to a painting while it's in a museum on loan? And the answer is that it turned out in Australia not very easily, which comforted us a good deal.
But true in the United States?
In the United States, if creditors of the owner were to obtain an attachment against the painting while it was in the jurisdiction where a court can get jurisdiction over it, it's conceivable that at least a cloud could be placed on the title of it.
Jay, are you warming up for Donald Trump?
Does he own any paintings? Yep.
Linda, can you tell us how much the Getty Trust has to spend on art each year?
Actually, I can tell you that we have been spending in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 million a year. It's pretty obvious that this did some interesting things to our acquisitions budget. And we're opportunistic about acquisitions, and we don't have a rigid rule in place about an amount that we have to spend per annum. But I think your question, because we're a private operating foundation under the Internal Revenue Code, we have to spend a certain amount of money per year. And we have nearly 700 employees and a lot of other activities, so we can't spend wildly on acquisitions without being irresponsible about our other budget obligations. But that's approximately the amount.
Linda, I've heard tell, and you probably heard this in the retail art market, that some people say that the museum is one of the great inflators of prices. What's the position down there on that?
Well, we can't go out and buy $75, $85 million pictures, and so I'd say that the market has moved past us at this point for great masterpiece paintings, which are always the top of the art market. And there were healthy underbidders in these auctions, as you saw when Alan Bond purchased irises. Walter Annenberg was one of the underbidders, and Citibank was the other on behalf of an anonymous investor. So there are plenty of other people out there happy to spend this kind of money. We've tried to be careful and collect in a broad number of areas, such as photographs, sculpture, decorative arts, and so forth, so as not to go deeply into any one market and gobble up everything and inflate those prices. And one reason that the trustees opened up all the other programs of the trust, in addition to the museum, is because they have to spend so much money every year that if they didn't have other things to spend it on and other good deeds to do in the world, then they'd be forced to spend probably too much on art acquisitions. So we think we're being responsible.
In connection with the conveyance problem, did you consider having another auction to decide the fair market value to be determined?
Well, the answer to that was no. As a practical matter,
no, you didn't consider it, or no, you didn't?
Well, it was not a possibility. The risk that it would bring a very distressed price at an auction was perceived to be so great by Sotheby's that they weren't prepared to consider an auction sale. They had coming up, and one of the things that was paramount in their minds was the upcoming May auctions that are just passed, at which there were a couple of very high-profile paintings coming up, and they wanted to have this transaction take place as quietly as possible, so as to cause the least possible disturbance to the art market, and let those auctions take place without this being a factor.
Jay, had Sotheby entered into an agreement with Bond prior to the auction that they were going to lend him 50% of the price?
Rob, you looked at the documents, yes, I think so. Yeah.
And that wasn't known to the other bidder, and Sotheby's conducting the auction?
I think that's right. Yeah, that's one of the bases on which Sotheby's was criticized.
They've discontinued the practice now. They have to have owned the work for 90 days, I think, before they'll give you security.
Tim, you know.
Following along, auction houses have also been criticized for guaranteeing the consignor a certain sum in connection with the sale. Did some of these guarantee the seller a certain price?
Yeah, we don't know if there was a. The question was whether Sotheby's had guaranteed the prior owner of the painting a certain price from the auction, and the answer is we don't know.
Well, the J. Paul Getty Museum is the proud owner of a rare Van Gogh. The Getty Museum announced today that it has purchased Vincent van Gogh's irises for an undisclosed price. Australian financier Alan Bond bought the painting for nearly $54 million. That was 3 years ago, and it made it the most expensive painting ever sold at auction. Bond recently sold the painting to the Getty Museum. Irises shows a garden in the asylum where Van Gogh had committed himself. He painted irises 1 year before he committed suicide.
A newly purchased, very, very, very expensive Van Gogh is hanging in the J. Paul Getty Museum tonight. The Getty Museum disclosed today that it is the proud owner of Vincent van Gogh's irises. The artwork sold for nearly $54 million 3 years ago. That was the highest ever, making it the most expensive painting ever sold at auction. Getty curators are not saying how much they paid for irises. The painting depicts the flowers growing in the garden of the asylum to which Van Gogh committed himself shortly before his death.
The latest paintings by Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh is now blooming at the Getty Museum in Malibu. The post-impressionist work titled Irises depicts a garden of flowers at the asylum in which the tortured artist had temporarily committed himself in 1889. The museum will not say how much it paid for the painting, but it was sold in 1987 for $54 million. During his lifetime, Van Gogh was able to only sell one of his paintings, and he committed suicide 100 years ago this summer.
Finally, right now, April showers may indeed bring May flowers, but Vincent van Gogh's flowers, specifically the painting Irises, brought $54 million 3 years ago when it was sold. That was a record. We don't know what the price was yesterday when the painting was sold once again. The new buyer is the J. Paul Getty Museum, and officials there are mum about the price. Having said that, I know that Spencer is waiting to go at it. Joan, I am counting on you to protect me.
No.
It took tulips to say that.
Oh! They both rose to the occasion. I don't know whether they're budding geniuses or blooming idiots.
Oh, how about while you still have a chance?
At least he's still